Hello, Psych 101, Dr. Johnson sections, Lincoln University of Missouri. Um, I'm recording this for us at about 1:50 p.m. on the afternoon of Monday, March 30th, 2020. And I believe that there's going to be two parts to this lecture on Dr. Jaak Panksepp's scheme for five basic emotions, five basic affects. So uh, I've been familiar with Dr. Panksepp's scheme for just about 3 years now, and have started incorporated it into my teaching. And there's a lot of things about it that I think really sort of flesh out many of the topics we've talked about. Okay, so we started talking about this in the last lecture, the Five Factor Model Part 2 lecture, which was broken up across 4 different videos. The word affect. And within psychology, the psychological sciences, we've already established that we tend to think about affect as the visible signs of emotional experience, and specifically, generally, we're talking about facial expression and body language. When I was talking about the psychological definition of affect in the last lectures, I said when we get to Dr. Panksepp, and I kind of telegraphed this some, the thing that I find extremely useful and thought-provoking about Dr. Panksepp's discussion of basic affects is that he advanced the argument that we're not only talking about body language and facial expression, but we're talking about specific brain areas that are involved with those particular emotional experiences. And one of the things that I find really useful about Dr. Panksepp's scheme, okay, go back and think about earlier in the semester when we were talking about behaviorism, especially kind of the John Watson and the B.F. Skinner approach to behaviorism, which apparently made the assumption that we're all robots that are completely programmed by interactions with the environment, according to schedules of reinforcement having to do with reward and punishment. And one of the things that I argued in class in front of you, in lectures in front of you, was that even though Dr. Skinner especially seemed to believe that he had everything that we needed to know about why people do the things they do worked out, that if you didn't really understand why some responses from the environment are rewarding and why other responses from the environment are punishing, you didn't really have it all worked out. And one of the things that we began talking about in the discussion of the five-factor model is that different people within the overall population, different people are rewarded or punished to greater or lesser degrees by different kinds of responses from the environment. We said that one way to think about neuroticism is that people who score high in neuroticism are, relative to other people who score medium or low, more punished by punishment, while people who score high in extroversion compared to people who score more medium or who score low, are more rewarded by reward. So this ties in, that all ties in with what Dr. Panksepp argued was what it is that the emotions are all about. That our emotional experiences give us information, and it's important information ultimately to our survival, but to whether we're having a good time or not. Our emotional experiences give us information about comfort and distress zones. So if we're thinking in terms of reward and punishment, things that increase the probability of future behaviors, things that decrease the probability of future behaviors. And Dr. Panksepp made the argument that these behaviorist terms, these operant conditioning terms, are actually just kind of placeholders for a deeper understanding of how it is that our basic emotional processes, which are in particular regions of the brain, regulate learning. So for Dr. Panksepp, the basic affects are the keys to what makes us learn. Let's talk a minute about facial expression. If you become a student of the history of psychological thought, from the beginning of psychology as a discipline through the 20th century and now on into the 21st century, one of the things to keep in mind is that during that part of the 20th century where behaviorism in academic psychology was really the dominant school of thought, the argument that lots of people tended to assume was that nurture, that is the effect of our lived interactions with the environment, how we're raised, was more important than the things that we're born ready to learn, ready to know how to do, things that are part of our nature. So we had a quote up. You can go back and find it in the slides. John Watson said, "Give me any infant child and I can grow that person, that infant child, to be any kind of person that you choose." That learning from the environment was way more important than things that we were born with. And so a lot of the investigations that various behavioral scientists engaged in, especially through the last 50 years of the 20th century, were investigating this idea. Is nurture more important than nature? Is it also possible that nature is less important, nurture or learning is less important than nature? And at this point in history, we've gotten to the point, I think, where we say both of those things are vital. We're all different. We're born with different kinds of tendencies to react to the environment, and then each of us are going to end up developing as the result of an interaction of both nature and nurture. So The short story was that for a long time, uh, for a couple of decades, the basic argument was that everything is learned uniquely and individually, including language, including emotional expression, especially during the last 30 years of the 20th century. The argument pretty much resolved that actually facial expressions are not learned culture by culture, but that facial expressions, in terms of being signals about our emotional experience, are essentially universal across culture. They can, to some degree, be faked, and when somebody's faking a facial expression, there are sometimes very small differences in the fine muscle groups on the face that we use to form our facial expressions, can still give things away. It's also true that in terms of the information that our facial expressions give about our emotional experience, it's actually easier to mask them or suppress them than it is to fake them. And different cultures have different rules about when it is or isn't okay to let people know what we're feeling, let other people know what we're feeling. For instance, compared to Western cultures, most of Europe and the United States, in terms of when it's okay to laugh out loud, show displeasure, uh, it's within Japanese culture, for instance, more frowned upon to openly express certain emotional experiences than others. How was it that we reached this point? This is a whole other class. It's a whole other class period. One of the number one behavioral scientists who really led the program of research and sort of broke ground for the kind of research that we needed to do to answer this question: are facial expressions universal, or are they learned specifically to culture? Was a guy named Paul Ekman. And you can sort of compare him if you want to remember Elizabeth Loftus, the woman who did years and years of research on memory. Dr. Ekman has kind of a similar track record in terms of publishing with a variety of students and colleagues. A variety of students and colleagues, the research that kind of led us to the conclusion that facial expression is universal. So these pictures aren't of Paul Ekman. These pictures are from Dr. Ekman's sort of original, his first research. And the man in these pictures is from Papua New Guinea, and these pictures were taken in the 1960s. And Dr. Ekman recognized that in order to really have a clean investigation of whether or not facial expressions are universal across cultures or are learned particularly by culture, knew that he had to go someplace where there was a population who had not heard a lot of radio, seen much film or television. And so the area of the world that he chose was Papua New Guinea, which is part of this island, New Guinea, which is, it's a big chunk of real estate north of Australia. And still to this day, Papua New Guinea is one of the most rural places in the world. The people there are very, very diverse culturally. I think there's between 160 and 170 different distinct languages that are spoken just in this portion. It tends to be really mountainous. It's pretty isolated. And Dr. Ekman went there and people who lived there and told them a series of stories. And the stories were supposed to invoke amusement, disgust, anger, and etc. And what he found was that these people who had not seen Western movies or pictures or even talked with people very much who came from Western cultures, if you told them sad stories, they looked sad. If you told them happy stories, we could recognize, yep, that's the same smile that people in the United States or France or Mozambique or wherever that had been more culturally touched. And after Dr. Ekman's initial work in Papua New Guinea, he came back to the United States where he didn't have to spend quite as much money and continued his work on facial expression. So here's a young woman who, these pictures are from, I think, the 1980s. More research that Dr. Ekman continued to do. Like, we can all pretty much decode what these facial expressions are telling us about what this young woman is feeling in response to whatever it is that's going on with her. We have a lot of fine muscles that are involved in facial expression. And so the fact that we've got so many itty bitty muscles and we've got not to some degree conscious, but not completely conscious control over them. Like we said, the two things that we can do is we can fake facial expression, but even when we're faking it, there's often some very small tells that with careful observation we can learn. And the second is, if you can't fake it, you can at least consciously try to hide it. So for instance, and you can find more than one example of this. What's this smile? This smile on the left is genuine. This smile on the right is faked. And the thing that you really want to look out for, if you're looking to see whether somebody is just turning their corners of their lips up and copying a smile, or they're really genuinely expressing feelings of pleasure that pleasure and or amusement that they're personally experiencing, is just this little upturn of muscles at the corner of the eye. If you've got a real smile, they're turned up just a little bit, and if you're faking it, that's not necessarily there. Here's another example. Besides the involvement, this one again is the fake smile. Besides the involvement of those tiny muscles at the corner of the eye that turn up with a real smile, if you are paying close attention to what's going on around the mouth, it's like There's just a little bit of stuff that's going on in the muscles around the mouth that aren't going on in the smile that is a fake smile.